Thank you so much, Mr. Mitchell, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for a very special discussion about the vital role of innovation in healthcare and the role it's playing during the global pandemic. During the next hour, you'll hear from our panelists, CEOs of the top hospital systems in Southern California. But before we begin, just a few notes about our format today. Your audio is muted, but if you have a question or a comment, please go ahead, enter them in the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and time permitting, we'll attempt to answer them for you. First, though, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our esteemed panelist. Johnese Spisso is president of UCLA Health, CEO of UCLA Hospital System, and Associate Vice Chancellor of UCLA Health Sciences. Dr. Jeffrey Smith is Executive Vice President of Hospital Operations and Chief Operating Officer for Cedar Sinai Health System. Rodney Hanners is Interim Chief Executive Officer for Keck Medicine of USC, and Dr. Elaine Batchlor is Chief Executive Officer of MLK Community Healthcare. Welcome to all of you. We're so happy to have you here today, and we are excited for this conversation. I'd like to begin by asking each of our panelists to tell us just a little bit about their healthcare organizations and how they're doing 14 months into the global pandemic. And Johnese Spisso, I'll go ahead and I'll start with you first.
Well, thank you, Judy, and welcome everyone. Reflecting on the past year and a half and where we are today at UCLA Health, I think we are better and stronger than we were even prior to the pandemic. And if anything, that's the real silver lining that this last year and a half has brought forward to us. We know that we're now able to care for patients with COVID and patients without COVID in a safe and effective manner and keep all patients and our staff safe. We've been able to rapidly reopen to all levels of care and return to full occupancy in our hospitals and clinics and expand telehealth throughout the region to serve even more patients who need care. Through the resilience of our staff, we've weathered actually 2 surges in Los Angeles hospitals. And we work together as a hospital system in Los Angeles in concert with our local government, with the citizens of Los Angeles, to really make sure that we could reserve the capacity needed to provide care. And finally, we learned a lot about how to care for patients with COVID-19, how to rapidly bring testing forward, how to develop monoclonal antibody infusions, and how to bring vaccines to the market that can really help us control this disease. So if anything, I think we've learned that our investments in emergency preparedness and research and innovation were really key to our success and hold a lot of promise for our future.
Ms. Spisso, thank you so much. Dr. Smith, how is Cedar Sinai faring?
First of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for allowing us to participate in this great forum. Cedar Sinai is in much the same position that UCLA Health is, and thank you, Johnese, for sharing that. Certainly, our community has benefited from having strong academic partners and academic health systems who have brought the latest technology to our communities to help serve our patients during this incredibly challenging time. We are also happy to be back to near normal operations. As of this morning, we had single-digit numbers of COVID patients in our hospital. And now the biggest challenge is actually accommodating the volume of patients who have deferred care. And so our operating rooms and other procedural areas are operating well over 100% of where they had been in the pre-pandemic phase. And unfortunately, we're seeing patients who are presenting later in disease. So we really want to make sure that people are contacting their healthcare providers, are scheduling those screening tests that they might have missed. We are open and able to care for you in a very safe fashion and looking forward to doing so.
Open for business. Dr. Smith, thank you. Dr. Batchlor, what can you tell us about MLK Community Healthcare and how your organization is doing?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I think that we are probably a little bit of a contrast to UCLA and Cedar Sinai in that we are not a tertiary research medical center. We are a small community hospital and medical group that is serving a uniquely underserved community of South Los Angeles. Almost all of our patients are African American, Latino, low income, mostly insured through Medicaid or lacking insurance entirely. And during the winter surge and through much of the COVID pandemic, we became the epicenter of Los Angeles. South Los Angeles had a disproportionate number of COVID patients, and our hospital was caring for a disproportionate number of patients. So even though we are a small community hospital, we had more COVID patients here than many hospitals that are 3 to 4 times our size. And our focus was really on access and operational effectiveness through the pandemic. And I strongly believe that having already established a strong culture of innovation and problem solving and being a nimble organization allowed us to get through the pandemic with flying colors. So while the story in the media was often about our hospital being overwhelmed and our community being overwhelmed, what I saw on a daily basis was a group of people at our hospital who were taking care of business, adapting, coming up with creative solutions. We were always able to source supplies, equipment, medications, the things that we needed to care for our community. And as Johnese said, we came through this feeling stronger than we felt when we went into it. We know that we can do this, not that we want to do this again, but I think that it gave us all a sense of confidence and pride at what we know we are able to accomplish. And our focus continues to be on communicating about the health disparities that exist in communities like ours before COVID, through COVID, and after COVID, and what we as a community and society need to do to seriously address those disparities. And it's not going to be found in the lab or at a research bench. It's really going to require us to think creatively and outside of the box about policy and systems. So, like the others, we are feeling that this is the end of the COVID pandemic. We're hopeful that this is the end. We have, I think, about 4 COVID patients in the hospital right now, but we know that there's a lot of hard work ahead of us.
Indeed, and we'll have a chance to explore so many of those themes that you just brought up during the next hour. But first, let me ask Mr. Hanners to give us some insight into the impact of the pandemic on Keck medicine of USC and how you're doing now, how you're doing this morning.
I'm doing very, very well this morning, Judy. Thank you.
Good.
And I'm glad to be part of the panel. And I just echo what Johnese and Cedars, with Jeff have said, and Elaine. But we're experiencing that same thing. The pent-up demand, where the demands come back. We've opened up all our services. But in reference to the question relative to the last 14 months, I think. I'll take a little slant. I don't take anything away from what Johnese and Jeff and Elaine had said. I think that very much our experience, but the culture was huge for us, in terms of the investment we put into our culture and the ability to come together quickly, make all the decisions that we've had to make over the last 14 months that changed week over week, and the credibility that established within our organization in doing what we say we're going to do and really putting our patients and our staff and the safety of our workforce first, I think came through in spades and really engendered a level of camaraderie across our various aspects that I don't think we would have gotten had we not had that common enemy being the pandemic and the virus. It really brought us together in ways, and as was mentioned, things that otherwise would have took us months to sit around a table and cajole about and get everybody's opinions. We had to make in days. And I think that gave us a new way of doing business going forward to help rapid cycle some of the things that we know we need to improve on. So that's what we're hoping to carry out after this is really to use that and galvanize that new way of doing business in a way that helps us meet the demands of our patients in a much faster way.
Absolutely. I think that our community members who are joining us today would be interested to know that all of you had had a chance to work together during the pandemic. So, Ms. Spisso, how did you establish those connections, and how did you engage when you were so busy just at your home institutions?
Well, thank you, Judy. It was really a remarkable effort, not only by those of us here on the panel, but really I felt by our entire Hospital Association of Southern California. That group of CEOs, we met weekly during the first few weeks. And then at the second surge, we were actually meeting daily, not only with all of the CEOs, but with LA County Department of Public Health, LA County Emergency Medical Services, particularly during that second surge when there was a lot in the media that you probably all saw about hospitals getting close to crisis standards. We really made a commitment as a group that we were going to do whatever we could so that no hospital got into that situation. So even though, for example, at UCLA, we were full and we had to open shadow beds, we really made it a priority that we would take those tertiary and quaternary care transfers from other smaller hospitals that didn't have the resources, even if that meant having to do care in the hallways. And we had some great cooperation from our regulatory agencies to give us some of those flexibilities to do that. So it really did take a team effort. And, you know, in addition to the hospital community, I think we all owe a lot of thanks to LA County, EMS, LA County Public Health, and really the people in LA for really following a lot of the stay-at-home orders and the preventative measures that were being moved forward.
I think that's great. Dr. Smith, I'm curious from your perspective at Cedar Sinai, having such close collaborators probably made a big difference for your institution.
Yes, you know, fortunately, there is a strong medical community here and pre-existing relationships that we could call upon. But it did cause us to need to work together in ways that we hadn't before, and even more closely. We became even more dependent on each other. Sometimes it was just a quick call to say, hey, what are you guys doing about this? And are you experiencing this? Or, hey, you know, we're really nearing crisis. Are there ways that you can help out? We were indeed pushed to our limits as a community of healthcare providers. So, you know, certainly the academic hospitals represented here, we do have a responsibility as far as caring and accepting for those acute care patients who require higher levels of care that can't be provided in other hospitals. Frankly, there were times when we were not able to do that, not able to accept any more patients. Here at Cedar Sinai, we were at 140% of our ICU capacity and providing that critical care in unique places like recovery rooms and hallways. And staffing became actually our biggest challenge. And I think that was likely shared by many of the institutions that are represented here. So once again, it really did call on us to work together in different ways and help support each other. I would say, you know, one of the lessons learned is we do need to depend on each other and can't depend on help coming from the federal government and limited help from the state government. And it really, a lot of it's going to require us to work together in new and creative ways. And we're now looking at how we create those plans that we can do so even better in the future.
Absolutely. Mr. Hanners, I don't know if your hand was up or if you wanted to jump in here. Did you feel comfortable picking up the phone and asking for help or maybe sharing ideas?
Johnese can attest to it. Yes. I reached out a few times and it was invaluable. I mean, I think in terms of getting a perspective from others, we're all facing the same stuff. And it was interesting. And it extends beyond Southern California. I think many of us are involved with Vizient and we're involved with Leadership Institute. And that was really a great help. And we, as a California contingent, kind of shared our perspectives in terms of what we were facing here, but got a lot of great innovation and ideas from others that I think was just invaluable. Either testing your thinking against others to make sure you're not off, thinking something strange. And there was a lot of validation in terms of how we were all looking at what we needed to approach and to speak with a common voice through our association to the state level on key common issues. And it was invaluable. And I was new in the role at the time and really hadn't had those predetermined relationships, but I appreciate Johnese and Tom and others in the market that leaned in and gave us the advice and it was invaluable.
I would imagine, Dr. Batchlor, that you agree with that as well. I know that you faced challenges. You talked about them in your opening remarks, but
Yes.
having this collaboration, this close-knit group.
Well, I think that we had a bit of a different experience from the experience of my colleagues. While we were all struggling, incredibly to get through the pandemic, the volume of patients in the county was not evenly distributed. And as I mentioned, there were a disproportionate number of patients in South LA. And at times we felt like we were struggling through this alone. And that led me to do something that I had never done before, which is on Christmas Eve, during the peak of the winter surge, I wrote a letter to the governor. And I said, let me tell you what's happening in South Los Angeles. And I have to say that the state was very responsive. On December 26th, the day after Christmas, he sent a team that included EMS and public health from both the state and the county to our hospital to meet with us to see what we were contending with. And after that meeting is when the public health departments convened the all hospital meetings that occurred every day when we were in the thick of the pandemic. And it was really, it really did kick up a notch the opportunity to talk about what's happening across the hospital system and to coordinate and to try to rebalance the load of patients and to transfer patients who needed a higher level of care. And so I do want to give a lot of credit to the state and to the county for recognizing that and for pulling that level of coordination and collaboration together.
Absolutely. The heart and soul of all of your organizations are your workforces. So let's talk a little bit about resiliency. And Ms. Spisso, I know working on your communications team at UCLA Health, I know some of the things that you've done personally and how you've reached out, but let's talk a little bit about some helpful tips and things that you think made a big difference in helping to have a more resilient workforce.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, all the credit goes to our healthcare workforce for really getting us through this pandemic. But as mentioned, I really felt that during that second surge, we had pure exhaustion of healthcare team members. So a lot of the things that we did in the first part of the surge, with meals being delivered, with hotel rooms, with assistance in childcare, with wellness stays, meditation, yoga, anything we could do to help staff relax. That really wasn't enough during that second surge. What people wanted there was just rest and time off. And as mentioned, we were in critical shortages of staff. I think, the added challenge that we had, particularly as tertiary and quaternary care medical centers, is not only did we have COVID patients, but we had all the critical and complex patients who were in our hospitals every day. People with cancer, people with organ transplants, people with severe heart disease, pediatric patients with those same things. And that care can't be deferred. So even though we were deferring anything that was non-critical or emergent, we were bursting with those patients as well. And as mentioned, when the first surge, when we had to defer a lot of people who at that time weren't emergent, they quickly became urgent as they were waiting weeks to come in. So we had to try to get an additional 9,000 deferred patients in for procedures. So the amount of activity and what that did to our workforce was really something that we had never faced before in the past. So we were constantly, as Rod mentioned, we were reaching out to the New York hospitals to say, is there anything that you did innovative to support staff during this time? And I still think now we're seeing a lot of the delayed effects of staff who have really weathered this incredible amount of stress.
Dr. Smith, I would imagine you felt the same strain and stress at Cedar Sinai. Long hours, long days, a lot of expectations.
Yes, I think that's really true. During the first surge, we were operating under a health order that really limited everything else that we could do at the hospital. So we weren't doing any scheduled surgeries at the time, and we actually had lots of extra people around who could be redeployed to help. As we approached the second surge, the biggest thing was that the numbers were just so much higher. But it was on top of patients who had gone untreated during the first surge and had delayed care and needed more emergent care. So we were stretched much thinner. In addition to that, early in the pandemic, it was hitting parts of the country at different times, and we were able to access traveling nurses or agency nurses to help support our staff. During the most recent surge in January and February, it hit most of the country at about the same time. And so there weren't traveler staff or additional staff, temporary staff that could be accessed. And those that could came at an incredible premium. We were paying incredible wages in order to acquire any additional supportive staff and competing against others all across the country. And so our ability to bring in outside staff to support our caregivers was limited. And we did the best we can. In many cases, did have to pay those premium rates. I also agree with Johnese. I think that we're now seeing some of the longer term or lasting effects of the test. And we're even seeing some post-traumatic stress disorder amongst healthcare workers across the country. And so it's really important that we're in tune to that we're watching for that we're providing supportive services so that we can truly care for those caregivers who stepped up in a heroic way. I think at first they were running on adrenaline, and now they're kind of coming off of that and trying to resume their more normal lives. It's a difficult time.
Dr. Batchlor, do you echo that? Does that sound familiar to you?
Absolutely. Our healthcare workers did an amazing job. They just kept their focus on patient care and doing what was necessary to take care of the increasing volume of patients that came in. I think there were two things that we did that were really important to support our staff. One was really close and regular communication and transparency with the team about what we were doing, about how much PPE we had, acknowledging their fears and their challenges. And the second was, what I mentioned before, when I reached out to the governor and asked for help, and we got the help that we asked for. We ultimately were able to access over 90 traveling nurses through the state and a number of respiratory therapists. And, really what the staff needed, as Johnny said, was they needed respite. They needed help. They needed, to not be taking care of, so many patients that they were worn out. And so getting that additional help was really critical for us. Now with the pandemic starting to wane, we've also been fortunate to bring in additional resources. So, during the pandemic, the community really came to help us with food and other types of resources. We were lucky to get a grant that enabled us to hire a full-time licensed clinical social worker who has been able to offer both individual sessions with staff, group sessions, and really enhanced the resources that we have available to support people through the emotional and mental challenges of working through a pandemic. And as Jeff said, I think, a lot of healthcare workers hold it together to get through the immediate crisis. And then after it's over, we have to continue to provide that support that they need as they think back on, some of the terrible things that they witnessed.
Mr. Hanners, I'd like you to weigh in too from the USC Keck perspective. I'm sure you've seen some of the same things. I'm curious what you've done that may be unique or different or maybe similar.
Yeah, well, similar to what's been mentioned, obviously the hotel rooms, I think we've given 31,000 hotel room nights for folks that were worried about bringing COVID home to their families or for those that needed to be quarantined. The one thing that I didn't hear mentioned that I know we all experienced was on top of the demand that we're getting in the second surge, we also had our own staff that were turning positive because of the community acquired. So we had at any given time 300 to 400 staff that were out on quarantine because they had contracted the virus from a family member or what have you. Most of us, even though we had our workforce that did acquire the virus, very few internal to our facilities. It was a lot of community acquired that was impacting us. So, that doubled down on the issues in terms of the staffing. I think the point that we've made it through these 14 months, we're not out of the woods yet in terms of our staff, is really where we've shifted our focus. And in fact, we're looking at a month of healing for folks that have either lost folks in their families or because of the work that they've done, have seen so much tragedy, a lot of PTSD, as Jeff mentioned, and looking at creative ways where we can get people into a healing mode. We provide the things that Johnese talked about. Our psychiatry department had a lot of sessions with and open for both families as well as our caregivers that I think has played out pretty well. People took advantage of that, but it did tell us a lot about what we needed to focus on for our workforce going forward. We had the luxury of the university and the School of Law being helpful for folks that may be looking at advanced directives or trusts or those sorts of things. We had tutoring that several of our schools tutored kids from our families that were struggling a little bit with the homeschooling activities. Just a lot of unique things. Music therapy for those that get. We had our school music and others. So a lot of those things that just we're trying to both demonstrate that we care and really provide an impact for our workforce in terms of what they were going for. But yeah, that was a tough one, Jeff. You mentioned that second surge, man. We're in Johnese and Elaine. Everybody was like, and then it's like, here we go again. And it was tough to get people up and motivated during that time. But
I like that you use the word, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to step on you. I was going to say, I like that you use the word creative, because I think all of you had to be creative as leaders. And Ms. Spisso, I'm wondering what adaptations did you make for care delivery? What were your organizational approaches that needed to adapt, both during the original first part of the pandemic and then certainly during the surge around the holidays?
Well, we had to rapidly really adjust all of our care. In the first few months of the pandemic, we had to implement over 200 new patient care protocols, really looking at every aspect of the business that we provide. So what you saw very quickly is all of us putting up tents outside of our emergency department so we could have a screening area that was dedicated. We set up over 41 testing centers in the community, drive-through testing centers. We looked at ways that we could move patients to less acute settings so that we could quickly preserve capacity for patients coming in. It really, certainly on the UCLA campus, made me really value the fact that we were sitting on a campus that is a research university and could call in to support us, our School of Public Health, our School of Nursing, our School of Engineering, our School of Business. We really leveraged the innovation in those areas to, start making a lot of face shields. They were able to make a drive-through testing station that protected the staff member doing the tests. It was really a way to look at our investments in innovation and really bring those forward front and center to identify how we could get through the pandemic. And I'll also say, the value of being able to partner with private businesses in the community, which is something I think we all need to do more of, because it really helps us accelerate production of things that we need. So it really, I think as we go forward, it's one of the areas where we've learned a lot from that and will be better prepared as we go forward.
And maybe more efficient too. Dr. Smith, do you think that you've adapted in a way that has changed how you're doing business now?
Yes, absolutely. On almost every front. Certainly all of us have been talking about doing telemedicine for a long time and had some pilots going on. And, many of us had a multi-year plan where we would roll those strategies out and then ended up doing it over a matter of weeks. We just put the tools in people's hands and said, figure it out, which is different for healthcare. We were talking a little bit earlier about this forced us to be much more agile. rather than doing these constant tests and slow progress. And so, certainly telemedicine and virtual visits have become part of our care, which will continue. On the business side too, we switched overnight to have almost about over a third of our workforce moved to working from home almost overnight. And we had to deploy the technology infrastructure to do that very rapidly. And now we're figuring out which of those people need to come back and who can continue to work from home, as many industries are doing. Lots of leveraging of some of the existing technology and just accelerating that into the healthcare field and applying them in new and unique ways.
So, Dr. Batchlor, we've got creativity, we've got agility, we've got efficiency. Anything else you would add to that list of adaptations that have helped you to do your job?
Well, we did all of those things as well. And, we adapted in converting every type of space in the hospital to care space. We'd had experience doing that before COVID because we've had one of the busiest emergency departments in the county. And even before COVID, we had a tent outside of our ED. And so we'd had some experience with making those types of adaptations. We also pushed as much care outside of the hospital as possible. So I agree that telemedicine became a really important part of maintaining access for the community. One of the other things we did that was a little different was we executed a contract with an ambulance company that we'd been working with previously to do paramedicine visits to our patients at home. So when we were discharging patients from the emergency department and the hospital that we were concerned about, we wanted to make sure that we had a strong connection to those patients. So paramedics actually went into their homes and checked their vital signs and other biological parameters, medications, coordinated with their physicians to make sure that we were ready to intervene early if anything went wrong there. I would say that one of the other things that was important in terms of innovation was the partnerships that we developed with other organizations. So, for example, we developed a very strong partnership with the International Medical Corps, which is an organization that typically works in developing nations when they're experiencing health crises. And they kind of adopted us and provided us with a lot of supplies, equipment, and capital. We got a medical grade tent, we got ventilators, we got home biometric monitoring devices. So we got a lot from the partnerships that we formed as well.
Long-lasting relationships, I hope. And Mr. Hanners, let's talk a little bit about what you see as being very valuable from your adaptations.
Yeah, I think many of the things that have been mentioned, the one thing that I want to touch on that I think Elaine mentioned that's, the protocols that Johnese mentioned. I mean, there's so many protocols. What PPE do you wear for this scenario? What do you wear for that scenario? And, how do we get patients so we can test them before a perioperative or a high-risk procedure and get them in 72 hours ahead of time, even though a lot of that workflow, it sounds easy at my table. Say, yeah, let's do it this way. But to get it out and to get it educated and so the folks know what they need to do and was really a lot of work. And then once you got it right, the evidence changed and the policy changed. So you got to go change it. That, I think, was the biggest challenge that I think we grew a lot through that process, too, in terms of how to best do that I think is going to carry us into the future. But that's the only thing I'd add to the comments that have been made.
Very good. I'd like to talk a little bit more about innovations that emerged because of, not just during the pandemic, but because of the pandemic. And Ms. Spisso, I know that at UCLA Health, innovations happened because we needed them, but they were also on the cusp maybe of happening anyway, and it sped things along. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've seen as being some of the biggest innovations.
Yes, well, special thanks to our researchers at UCLA Health and our David Geffen School of Medicine. I was thrilled that during the first week in the pandemic, one of our laboratory medicine physicians, Dr. Omai Gardner, said that he could do the COVID test, and we could do those in-house. So we were thrilled to be one of the first in California that could do that. And that allowed us, of course, to really reduce the amount of time we were waiting to see if patients were COVID positive. We were able to get those results back in a few hours. And then we were able to lend those testing as well to places like the Venice Family Clinic, which is a federally qualified health center that's staffed by all UCLA employees, and really begin to give those tests in our homeless population, which we were very concerned about the spread in those communities as well. Additionally, our researchers developed a SwabSeq, which was a rapid multiplexed COVID-19 test, a saliva test, and they were granted emergency FDA use and authorization. That technology really allowed us to test tens of thousands of samples for coronavirus at the same time. Additionally, we rapidly signed on to participate in the vaccine trials, and we were doing those trials at UCLA Health. We also were participating in the monoclonal antibody study and a variety of other studies so that we could rapidly learn how to best treat and hopefully prevent the spread of COVID-19. So it was a great example to look at, our entire workforce in the health system collaborating with the researchers and really bringing a lot of this forward. For me personally, it made me see the value of our investments in research over the years. And I think if anything brought to light that we need to do more of that, and also investments in public health.
Dr. Smith, what investments would you like to share with us that you made on your campus?
The first thing I'd like to say is some of the best innovation was some of the simpler things that were designed by our nurses and frontline caregivers. So, for example, the nurses came to us and said that, going in and out of the patient's room presents a risk every time you had to do that. And so they asked can we put some more windows in the doors? So we took down 300 doors in between patients, put a 2x2 window in the door. The nurses also developed a strategy of using longer IV tubing so that the IV machine could actually be positioned outside the patient's room so that they could change the medications and silence the alarms and reprogram the pumps without having to spend an extended time at the bedside. Fostering a culture of innovation like that, I think, is really important as well. And then in addition, we too shifted much of our research structure towards COVID because many of the other labs were shut down and couldn't enlist patients during that time because they were closed. And so we too had innovations around medical therapies, including the remdesivir trials, the monoclonal antibody trials. We have a stem cell therapy trial for patients with myocarditis or inflammation of the heart related to COVID. We have a long-term study looking at antibodies in healthcare workers and how they initially picking up how people were exposed, how long those antibodies stuck around, and now looking at the response to vaccines as well. So I do think that really, there too, the agility and flexibility of our researchers who shifted from whatever they were working on to focus on COVID and bring those advances to our patients as quickly as possible was really helpful.
It was vital, I bet. Dr. Batchlor, you mentioned some innovations that you've already seen at your institution. I'm wondering if you wanted to mention a few others now that you've heard Ms. Spisso and Dr. Smith say a few words.
Sure. And I would agree with Jeff that some of the innovative and creative things that our staff did were small things like using iPads for staff who really did not need to be at the patient bedside, but needed to interact with patients. And we even used telemedicine to allow some of our physicians who ultimately ended up in quarantine to be able to continue to provide patient care even while they were absent from the hospital in quarantine. I think we benefited from the fact that our hospital is a high information technology hospital. Even before COVID came along, we're a HIM 7 hospital. We've made a lot of investments in information technology, and we leveraged them during the pandemic. One of the new things that we started during the pandemic was an artificial intelligence powered chat bot that we named Mia, who is still with us. And we put Mia on our website, and we used Mia to educate our community about COVID and to connect our community with care and to triage our community. So Mia, provided information, helped people evaluate their symptoms, and connected them to the appropriate source of care. We eventually even contracted with a telemedicine company to provide telemedicine visits for community members who did not have access to telemedicine through their health plan or through their existing provider organization. And we used Mia to connect community members to those services. And as the pandemic continued, Mia started to get, a little more and more sophisticated. That's how AI works. And today we're proud to say that, Mia is an adolescent and continuing to grow and to provide value to our community in terms of access and education.
It's amazing how something that is so sophisticated can be so helpful. We did something similar with a chat bot, Ms. Spisso, with our website as well. And I think you probably would say that it's been very useful for our patients, don't you think?
Yes, definitely. And our staff.
Mr. Handers, let me have you say a few words about innovation from your perspective as well. I think this is such an important part of this conversation to know that things were done during the pandemic, but they will have long-lasting impacts and maybe change the way all of you will do business in the future. I'm wondering if you heard something or if you wanted to add something from your own perspective.
Yeah, I think ditto everything that's been said. I think the small innovations were really profound, throughout our institution. I think one of them that I think can carry us forward along the lines of your question, we were all challenged with highly acute patients that didn't have loved ones at their bedside. The visitation restrictions were really huge. And so how do we connect families with their loved ones in our acute environments during the pandemic was a challenge that many in our patient experience department and on our floors looked at creative ways. Again, not terribly innovative, you'd think, but just connecting via tele, some way with an iPad or with our patient information system to be able to connect folks with loved ones that I think can carry us into the future and keep that connection, even though visitation will get relaxed, obviously. So that's just one that comes to mind. I think the bots have been really creative. We haven't named ours yet, Elaine, but just the triage for vaccines, it played very heavily in terms of getting folks through the maze of who's open now and are you eligible, and then get them into the medical record and get them scheduled. So that was very helpful for us, as well as for post-discharge follow-up calls to be able to connect folks and look for adherence with meds and questions that they might have. So those are three areas anyway, Judy.
Dr. Batchlor, you mentioned the chatbot, Mia, improving access to care. So I'd like to know from each of you, and I'll start with you, Dr. Batchlor, what you've been doing in particular to reach out to underserved communities during the pandemic, whether it's educating them about COVID vaccines, testing, or improving care in other ways.
All of the above. We had a COVID testing site on our campus. We've gone all in on vaccinating the community, and we have been using our own hotspotting to target specific neighborhoods where we know that the residents are more vulnerable than others. And we've taken mobile vaccination pop-ups into those neighborhoods. We've done over 50 different locations for vaccinations. We've done a combination of stationary and mobile. We allowed residents to walk up so that they did not have to navigate through a confusing and frustrating online registration process. And we've also seen tremendous uptick in telemedicine. And for us, one of the benefits of telemedicine for our community was a significant decrease in no-shows for appointments. So while we had very high no-show rates for in-person appointments prior to the pandemic, when we moved many people to a telemedicine platform, the no-show rate just went way, way down. So, our long-term work is focused on increasing access to the full continuum of care needed in our community and to providing prevention and disease management to our communities of color. And we're using both brick and mortar and virtual and mobile healthcare to do that, and using all of the data that we have on the community to target our efforts.
So, Ms. Spisso, Dr. Batchlor mentioned telemedicine. It's one of our questions from our audience as well. I know UCLA Health has seen a dramatic increase in telemedicine visits. That improves access to care in so many ways. Tell us a little bit about what's happening at UCLA Health.
Yes, definitely. I think we all were able to really recognize some of the fruits of our investments in really state-of-the-art electronic health information systems. At UCLA Health, we've always had the technology for several years, but what we saw very quickly in the pandemic was the adaptability both by patients and providers to use that. So we provided over 500,000 telemedicine visits in the first year of the pandemic. And what we're seeing now is about 20% of our ambulatory visits are remaining delivered by telemedicine. And that's opened up tremendous capacity to see more patients who actually need to come in. I'd also like to mention, and just in following up to what some of our colleagues said, I think, with vaccine distribution, we all worked very hard in the initial vaccine release. Our biggest challenges was limited quantities. So one of the things that we did at UCLA Health was to develop a social vulnerability index to prioritize who got the vaccine. So in addition to medical conditions, we added the SVI so that we could distribute that. Where we are now with more vaccine, we still know that there are some communities, particularly in Los Angeles, as we look at our heat map, of where we need to have higher levels of vaccine acceptance. So we've all been working together on that. One of the things that we did is hosted a Laker Legend panel where Laker legends who are respected in these communities could talk about vaccine acceptance. And so we're looking at additional ways to creatively reach out, but I think it's something that we still have to invest more work and efforts in to really start to combat some of the challenges that we're seeing.
Let me unmute. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar did a very good job with that. So, Dr. Smith, I want to ask you, one of our questions is along the lines of what we're talking about. What are your hospitals doing to encourage inclusive medical care? So, Cedar Sinai, I know, being such a major institution in Los Angeles County, is taking a role as well. Help us to understand where you're moving in that direction to make sure that underserved communities have access to care.
Yes. So I would agree with Johnese that we, started out by having a large mass vaccination site, and that was effective at first. And now we're at a point where we really need to go to where the people are and target those communities. And the way we're really approaching that is by working with community partners, like Martin Luther King. And so we have supported the vaccination efforts that Dr. Batchlor and her institution have done. They know their communities very well. We're providing some extra staffing to help go to those underserved populations. We also supported the LAUSD mass vaccination site at SoFi Stadium to vaccinate all of the educators, which has helped to get schools back in session. We're partnering with the Boys and Girls Club. We're partnering with local parishes. Having that local community connection, I think, is really key as we move into this next phase of addressing vaccine hesitancy and underserved communities.
Absolutely. Mr. Hanners, do you want to jump into the conversation here too?
Yeah, I think it's critical for us. It's sitting in the middle of Boyle Heights here. A disproportionately hit community was a real focus of ours, as well as South LA. We kind of did this together with the university. And many of the things that have been mentioned, I think the one unique thing, we've got a street medicine program. And so we've got physicians that go out into the street of homeless, and they've been vaccinating individuals. So that's been a unique, and we touch as many as we can, but trying to expand that program. So that was a unique one. working with our community groups, working with the parishes, all of that was very effective for us, but also helping them with access. So we looked at our EVS workers and our cafeteria workers, and then we encouraged them to bring their families in. Many of them had transportation issues, so we shuttled them and used the shuttle to do some of that work. I think the only other thing is we've got one of our family practice physicians that's going out for those that are homebound and helping vaccinate those in the underserved areas that are homebound and going right into the home with our vaccines. So a lot of creative things. I'm very proud of our teams. The university, I know the School of Pharmacy, I think Elaine as well has been down helping out with the efforts in the South LA area. So.
Thank you. We started the conversation talking about where you are now after 14 months. So I'm curious if you would be willing to humor me and take a look back and maybe think about what you would have done differently at the start of the pandemic. And Ms. Spisso, I'll start with you. I'm really putting you on the spot here. Anything you would have done differently if you had known this was coming? I know there are things I would have done differently, but what would you do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because we actually began following the pandemic in December when things through our international program through UCLA Health Global Health and watching what was happening in China. And what I would say is, we began to start doing things differently every day, and particularly when we started to recognize there were cases in Los Angeles. The only thing that I'll say was really curious is I remember we were on a conference call, and this was in March, with our partners in China. And we were in our command center all sitting around the table, and we noticed that they were all sitting 6 to 8 feet apart. They were all masked. And we didn't start our masking mandate till like later that following month. So it was interesting because after that meeting, we were thinking, what do they know that we don't know? And a lot of it was the asymptomatic transmission that we were just learning about. So again, I think, with every emerging infectious disease, we've learned things throughout. Hopefully the lessons learned in this will continue to make us better prepared.
Dr. Smith, I'm sure you're better prepared. Anything you would have changed or done differently at the beginning?
Yes, I would have bought stock in a plexiglass company.
Or wipes or something, right?
Right.
Sanitizer.
As you've seen in almost all environments, and especially in healthcare, we have plexiglass shields up throughout our institutions to help provide an extra layer of safety. I think that, certainly one of the lessons learned is it was one of the worst timing of an initiative that we could have done. We were just in the process of going to what they call a low unit of measure for our supply chain. So it's kind of just in time supply delivery to the sites where you need it. It really helps in reducing costs. It helps in decreasing waste. It helps in keeping things from going expired. It helps prevent hoarding, all of these good things that we seek to do in supply chain. Unfortunately, it's terribly unsuited for a pandemic when you need lots of supplies on hand. And so we learned that lesson the hard way, but did recover and now have certainly have stockpiles like many others do to care for another pandemic in the future.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Dr. Batchlor, looking back, anything that you're now wiser for or you would change?
Well, yes, we always say hindsight's 20/20, right? And I'm not sure that if we had done things differently that, we would have had a different outcome. But one of the things that we really learned about through the pandemic was how to leverage the media to spread the message about the needs of our community. We have a very strong media relations and communications team at the hospital. And one of the decisions we made early on in the pandemic was that we would be transparent with the media. And we knew that it was a risk because when you invite the media into your hospital and you start talking to them, you never know what the story will be because you don't control the story, they do. And they will write the story the way they want to write the story. But we thought it was worth taking the risk. And we had reporters who embedded with us. And we had, reporters coming from all over the world. And we found that it was actually very effective way to communicate and to even, highlight some of the issues that would ordinarily not get much attention. And that's something that I think we plan to continue to do. And we've been able to develop some very close relationships with some of the important media outlets as a result of their interest, in the telling the pandemic story, but then starting to dig deeper on some other stories that we want to tell around health disparities and the need for investment in our underserved communities.
Well, the pandemic certainly generated so many amazing stories. I don't think we'll ever run out of them to tell. Mr. Hanners, do you want to jump in here too? Looking back, I like that hindsight is 2020, right?
Yeah, I was going to say it is. And so there are a lot of things we could have probably, we learned. I don't know that we could have done differently, but we'll certainly do differently in the future. And just how you stand up and get everybody engaged early on and get the right things on the agenda that you got to be working on. It was a little clunky at the first, just to get organized around it. So, and then not lose all this great work, that was done and all these protocols, and make sure that they get codified and we can more easily ramp up if ever having to face this again. And so I think those are some of the things. I think also, we all sat with in the first surge, which really was not a surge when you compare it to the December, January surge. We all, we cut back on a lot of stuff and had a lot of empty hospitals. And I think we won't fall into that trap again in the future, and make sure that we're a little bit more surgical, no pun intended, in terms of how we approach that situation of capacity. I know a lot of it had to do with PPE at the very beginning in terms of preservation of that PPE. One of the things we did early on, we didn't buy that this was not an airborne situation. And so we never relaxed off N95s for certain procedures because we just didn't believe what was coming out on that. And our infectious disease folks played a big role in that. So we were fairly proud of that, but that was meaning we had to go at risk a little bit in terms of when our next shipment of N95s was coming in. But that's what I'd offer, Jude.
Definitely a balancing act. We have about 4 minutes left in our discussion today, and I'd like to give each of our panelists a chance to make some closing remarks. And Mr. Hanners, don't close your mic up yet, because I'm going to start with you and ask you to please just say a few more words. It could even be more lessons learned or just some thoughts that you'd like to leave with our audience today.
No, I think I just appreciate the collaboration, camaraderie around our health system executives in Southern California in particular. Just to overemphasize that point, I think that's going to make us a stronger health system into the future and stronger for the communities that we all serve. And I think the relationships that have been forged will benefit us and our patients and our communities long into the future. So I'd part with that.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Batchlor, a few words from you, please.
Yes, I guess I would go back to some of the comments that Johnese made at the beginning, which is I think that we wrap up the pandemic feeling more confident in our ability to meet the next challenge that comes. And, we've been through this successfully. I think we feel that we can take on the next challenge. I hope that the lessons that we learned about the connectedness of all of our communities and the need to pay more attention to the most vulnerable in our communities will persist once the attention that's been generated by the pandemic has receded.
Very good. Dr. Smith.
I'd just like to echo what Dr. Batchlor had said. I think that we are looking for ways to continue to expand our partnerships and support for the community and increase our diversity and inclusion efforts, as well as addressing healthcare disparities. And I think that all of the institutions have renewed their commitment to that, and we look to continue to support you in that work. I would like to continue to encourage people to get vaccines. We're not there yet. It has shown to be very highly effective and very safe. And that's what's going to help prevent the development of further mutations of the virus and hopefully restore us to a truly new normal, and we can continue to a much brighter future. So if you haven't gotten one, any of our institutions would be happy to provide you with one.
Yes, they would. That's an excellent public service announcement. And finally, Johnese Spisso, we'll let you have the final word here.
Well, thank you. And in addition to what my colleagues have said, I would just say, I really feel we've learned through this how to harness technology aggressively, both with telehealth and remote monitoring, how we need to accelerate innovation. We've seen that with testing, treatments, with vaccines, and with our supply chain. The work that we need to do on continuing to invest in emergency preparedness to prepare for that next emerging infectious disease. And also, I think we learned a lot about the work ahead in eliminating racial disparities in care. COVID brought that to light more than anything in a profound way. And then lastly, I just want to say the need to continue to integrate and invest in mental health services. I think this pandemic was profound, what we saw in the needs and in the increasing in anxiety and depression, particularly in our youth. So the investments that we can make in the future in that will be paramount.
Agree with you on that. Thank you so much to Johnese Spisso, Drs. Geoff Smith and Elaine Batchlor, and Broad Hanners. I want to thank everyone in our community who joined us today. On behalf of everyone at LA Best, I'm Judy Fortin. Please stay safe, take good care, and now we'll take a break. Bye, everyone.